my children's school and friends of their schools, I've asked loads of kids who've been in the house in the last couple of weeks, have you been discussing the Middle Eastern conflict at school? And not one school has gone near it. And that just shows how emotional and how incendiary this issue is. But I still think it's sad that people aren't discussing it. And now we're not educating kids that there can be two sides.
And they should, but also, in the run-up to Remembrance Weekend, do they talk about the poppy in schools?
Not enough.
Yeah.
They did lots of stuff on Diwali. They didn't do an awful lot on the poppies. They didn't do an awful lot on the memorial. And in fact, there was a bit of a survey, wasn't it, that showed how few young people know what the Memorial Weekend and Remembrance Sunday was actually about. So it starts at schools. Let's encourage conversation.
Yeah, now, the government says it's going to introduce emergency legislation, we heard this before, to deem Rwanda as a safe country and end the legal challenges.
Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, was on Patrick's show last night. Let's have a listen to what he said.
We are unanimously of the view that they were entitled to reach that conclusion. The changes needed to eliminate the risk of refoulement may be delivered in the future, but they have not been shown to be in place now. The Home Secretary's appeal is therefore dismissed.
Mr. Speaker, it's very straightforward. He promised that he would stop the boats this year. Yeah. This year.
Now, the keen-eyed amongst you will have noticed that was not Lee Anderson. That was Lord Peel, I think, yesterday. Lord Reid?
Lord Reid.
Reid.
And that was Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, making another useless intervention in the Commons. But we were hoping to listen to Lee Anderson, but we haven't got him, so we're going to
paraphrase. Shall I paraphrase for you? Because I watched it. Lee Anderson basically said we should be turning people back on the day that they arrive. They should be sent straight back to where they came from.
He also said, ignore the Supreme Court and just put them on the planes now. But we know that's not going to happen. Let's go to our political editor, Chris Hope, who's in Whitehall, Westminster, for the latest. Chris.
Andrew and Bev, yes, indeed. We heard that. We know what Lee Anderson thinks. Get the planes take off as soon as they can. I've got with me now a former Attorney General, known to many viewers from the Brexit wars, as I describe them, Sir Geoffrey Cox. I'll bring him in now on his view on what happened yesterday. Sir Geoffrey Cox, were the judges right, do you think, to reject this plan for Rwanda?
Well, the judges rejected it on the basis of evidence that it said that the first court, the first instance court, had not properly considered. Evidence that related to the grounds for believing that there might possibly be the return of refugees, asylum seekers to countries of their origin, which would obviously be unsafe.
So the concern would be about people sent here from the UK to Rwanda, where would they be sent after that country? So you weren't surprised by the ruling at all?
Well, on the face of the evidence, no. I mean, the judges were very clear that there was sufficient evidence to give grounds for them to believe that there would be a risk of what is called refoulement, and I think on the evidence that judgment can't be faulted. What matters now is, can those concerns be addressed? I think they possibly can. The Prime Minister's set out what I think sounds like a perfectly coherent plan. A lot will depend on the detail, both of the treaty and the bill he proposes, but it's a perfectly coherent way forward, and I'm delighted the Prime Minister has now decided to grip this very important issue.
And you think his idea can work to upgrade a memorandum of understanding with Rwanda to a full-blown treaty and pass it through the building behind you, Parliament, in, say, 40 or so days, and then maybe the first flights take off as late as May, he said last night in Number 10?
Well, it's difficult for me to anticipate or predict a timetable. What I'm saying is that the programme that he set out of a treaty, and the content of that treaty will be important. It must clearly have further safeguards. The fact it's a treaty itself will answer one objection that the Supreme Court had, which is that it was an unenforceable memorandum of understanding. But there must be more in that treaty to address the facts. But once those facts have been changed, once there are additional safeguards, I think it's perfectly legitimate for Parliament to be the institution that decides. It's the supreme lawmaking authority in this country. And I think the Prime Minister is right to say that it should decide. Now, you're quite right, of course, Chris. Whether the House of Lords seeks to impede its progress, whether it objects and whether it bogs it down is another matter. But I think the Prime Minister is setting out probably the only plan available to him.
I mean, the peers might object to the fact that the 5 courts have ruled unanimously against the plan. The government's response is to change the law and force them to accept it. And peers behind you in that building might object to that.
Well, that isn't, of course, all that's being proposed. And I would agree if that was all that was being proposed. It would be quite wrong, I think, just to declare black as white and say that on the same facts we can say that this country is safe. But that is not what I understand the government's plan to be. The plan is to address some of these concerns, both in the treaty and outside it. There are plenty of ways of doing it. Imaginative ways were found in the withdrawal agreement after Brexit by setting up a commission that looks after and protects the rights of EU citizens here. Well, if we can find imaginative solutions inside a treaty that changes the facts, I can't see a real substantial objection to the Prime Minister's proposals, but a lot will depend on the detail.
But of course, you're an MP, you're a leading lawyer, leading barrister, but also an MP for many years standing in the West Country. How important is it that Mr Sunak gets this through and gets these flights taken off before the next election?
Look, there's a crisis of confidence in the entire system, and we can't simply turn away from it. The government is addressing the problem in multiple ways. It's reduced by 20,000 those coming across the channel. It's reduced the backlog by 50,000. It's making real progress. But we have to seize this nettle. And there is a political crisis of confidence that needs to be addressed. And it can only be addressed, I think, by the Prime Minister putting this to Parliament, both in the form of a treaty and in the form of a bill saying that this must now happen. And the courts, faced with primary legislation, would respect it.
As a lawyer, as a former Attorney General, though, why now? Why is Plan B emerging now? Why not do all this a year ago, as maybe Suella Braverman and Boris Johnson have been saying for a while?
Well, I think it was perfectly reasonable to see whether or not the existing arrangements that had been reached with Rwanda would suffice. But I agree with the implication of your question. I am troubled that the court identified serious weaknesses in the approach of the Home Office a year or so ago to the preparation of its case. For example, the country policy information notes were regarded as inadequate by the Supreme Court. That's the guidance that exists in connection with Rwanda. It hadn't looked sufficiently at the practicalities of the asylum system there. It hadn't looked at the previous experience with Israel. So I agree that there were shortcomings there, which I'm surprised at. But there's no reason why we shouldn't address them now. The treaty may very well be able to tackle many of those concerns and change the balance of the equation. I hope it will. We have to remember, Chris, that the Lord Chief Justice decided in his view that this was acceptable and lawful. We can't be far away when distinguished judges reach different conclusions. And I think the time has now come, Prime Minister has plainly decided that, to grasp this nettle.
And has he got it in him? The Daily Mail today says his eyes are burning with coal and with fury about this. You know the guy, he's your leader. Can he get this over the line?
I think he's slow to anger. But we saw at certain points in the leadership election that when the fire started, he's capable of sparking into energy and life. He's a very competent, I think very reasonable, very moderate man. But I think he has the bit between his teeth. And I say good luck to him, and I shall certainly support him. It will depend on the detail of the treaty. It will depend on the bill. But I think it's a recipe that could work.
And one final question to you, Sir Geoffrey. In one word, will flights take off for Rwanda before the next election?
You're asking me to bet. I think there's a good chance. That's not one word, that's 4 or 5. But I think there's a good chance if we seize this nettle, grip it, and move forward swiftly.
Well, Geoffrey Cox, thank you for joining us today on GB News. And as we heard there, seizing the nettle is what Sir Geoffrey Cox thinks Mr Sunak must try and do. He thinks he can see some fire in his belly.